The film commences by introducing Zoe, a professional woman, as she heads to the office of her therapist, Dr. Marcella. As the session begins, Dr. Marcella inquires about the purpose of their meeting, prompting Zoe to open up about her personal life. She reveals that she is married, has 2 children, and her mother resides with her. Despite having a seemingly content family, Zoe confides in the therapist that she experiences a deep sense of emptiness within herself. Additionally, she admits to struggling with an addiction to alcohol. The narrative shifts to a flashback of a particular night shared with her husband, Jason. The flashback portrays a scene where they engage in a specific activity together. However, upon its conclusion, Zoe remains unsatisfied and endeavors to repeat the experience. Unfortunately, Jason falls asleep, leaving her frustrated. In response, she exits the room and seeks solace in another space where she indulges in watching movies while engaging in a particular hand-related activity. The following day, Zoe reaches her workplace where she oversees the careers of rising artists. Her closest friend and aide, Brina, hands her a portfolio containing details about a highly promising artist named Quinton. Intrigued, Zoe decides to visit an art exhibition showcasing Quinton's work. At the gallery, she encounters a man, and they end up in a disagreement. However, upon realizing that the man is Quinton himself, she feels mortified and apologizes for the earlier altercation. The atmosphere between them shifts, and they begin to flirt. Zoe soon mentions her marital status and discusses her company and her interest in managing his career. Even though Quinton continues to flirt with Zoe, he shows interest in her proposal. He suggests they meet another day for a more detailed discussion. Subsequently, we see Zoe confessing to her therapist about her attraction towards Quinton. Feeling guilty, she plans a special evening for her husband, Jason, but he ends up being held up at work. Disturbed by her emotions, Zoe informs her mother that she intends to visit a supermarket, but instead she secretly heads to a club where she commences drinking alone. Upon Jason's arrival home, he discovers Zoe taking a shower and expresses his regret for missing dinner. Their interaction leads to a passionate kiss, followed by another intimate encounter. During the night, Zoe finds herself engrossed in a dream where she engages in a similar activity with Quinton. The following day, she visits Quinton's studio, where he proceeds to sign a contract with her company. However, Quinton persists in flirting with Zoe, testing her loyalty. Despite being tempted to stay with him, Zoe ultimately decides to depart. However, Quinton intervenes, successfully seducing Zoe, and they once again engage in the previously mentioned activity. Filled with a sense of happiness for her actions, Zoe arrives at work, but her contentment is short-lived when she catches sight of a photograph featuring her family. Overwhelmed by guilt, she resolves to leave her job. Nevertheless, her assistant, Brina, attempts to dissuade her and mentions a businessman named Balthazar who shows interest in investing in their company. Distracted and unable to concentrate on the conversation, Zoe abruptly leaves. Back at home, her son expresses frustration over her absence from his soccer game. In response, Zoe fabricates an excuse, claiming to be ill, and promises to attend the next game. The following day, Brina informs Zoe that she has arranged a dinner between her and Balthazar. However, Zoe is visibly preoccupied and fails to fully engage in the conversation. After Brina leaves the office, Zoe decides to take matters into her own hands. She tears up the contract with Quinton and resolves to visit his house to bring an end to their connection. Upon arriving at Quinton's house, Zoe is cautioned by a neighbor that he has already left. Undeterred, Zoe chooses to leave the torn contract beneath his door as a symbolic gesture. Just as she's about to depart, Quinton unexpectedly appears, prompting Zoe to assert that she cannot pursue a relationship with him due to her love for her husband. Initially, Quinton agrees with Zoe's declaration, but then surprises her with a kiss and proposes that they go somewhere together. Zoe hesitates, but ultimately succumbs to his proposal. Quinton locks eyes with her and leads her to a shed where a painting he created after his father abandoned him and his mother tragically took her own life is displayed. Overwhelmed with emotion, Quinton confesses his deep-rooted desire to have a family and admits his struggle to resist Zoe, despite knowing it is morally wrong. Overwhelmed by the circumstances, Zoe eventually gives in to their desires. The two share a passionate kiss and find themselves engaging in the aforementioned activity on top of Quinton's car. In the evening, Zoe arrives late for a dinner meeting with an investor. She manages to reach just before he leaves and fabricates a story about her daughter being unwell as the reason for her tardiness. She pleads for another opportunity, and the investor agrees to reschedule the dinner. During her therapy session, Zoe continues to discuss her infatuation with Quinton and the guilt she harbors for betraying her husband. Soon we see Quinton and Zoe in his studio where he is painting, but Zoe distracts him and they engage in an intimate act. Zoe eventually falls asleep, and upon waking up, she discovers paintings of other women that Quinton has created, which sparks jealousy in her. This leads to an argument between them, and Zoe decides to leave. Upon reaching home, Zoe's son is upset again because she missed his game. She covers up by saying she had a work-related issue. Later, Kayla finds paint in Zoe's hair, but Jason remains unsuspecting. In her therapy session, the psychotherapist informs Zoe that she is suffering from an addiction, emphasizing that this type of addiction is as severe as any other. The therapist then recommends that Zoe bring her husband into the therapy sessions and encourages her to disclose her addiction to him. At home, Zoe becomes upset when she receives messages from her lover. However, Jason notices her new phone and expresses surprise, not knowing she had another device. She quickly concocts a lie, stating it was a gift from an investor. She then attempts to discuss the idea of couples therapy with Jason, but he dismisses it, expressing his disbelief in therapy. The following day, after Zoe and Quinton are intimate, he proposes that she leave her husband to be with him. She promptly declines, affirming her love for her husband. Upon deciding to leave, she is taken aback to discover that Quinton has painted a portrait of them together. Later, we see Zoe at a nightclub where she meets a man named Beckford. They end up in the restroom together in an intimate encounter. In her therapy session, Zoe shares this experience, admitting that she enjoyed the encounter with the stranger. When the therapist inquires about her childhood and the scar on her wrist, Zoe evades the question, claiming she has no recollection of that period in her life, and decides to end the session. After finishing work, Zoe heads to Quinton's residence, where she unexpectedly catches him engaging in the aforementioned activity with the neighbor. Filled with fury, Zoe confronts Quinton, leading to a heated argument that ultimately results in her breaking up with him. Seeking solace elsewhere, Zoe proceeds to visit Beckford's house, where she channels her anger by engaging in the same activity with him. Later that night, after putting her children to bed, Zoe and Beckford venture out to a nightclub together. Upon returning home, Jason confronts Zoe, demanding an explanation for her recent behavior. The couple engages in a heated argument about their relationship, during which Jason expresses his belief that Zoe has fundamentally changed from the person he initially married. In an attempt to diffuse the tension, Zoe tries to seduce Jason, but her efforts only serve to further ignite his anger. The following day, Zoe's workday takes a turn for the worse, leading to a confrontation with Brina, who confronts Zoe about her outburst and reveals that the company has lost several customers as a result. Subsequently, Zoe visits Quinton's house once again, this time to finalize the termination of their contract. However, their intentions are interrupted when some of Quinton's guests arrive unexpectedly. In a state of shock, Zoe hastily seeks a hiding place and is astonished to discover that Jason is among the guests. While Zoe is engaged in a conversation with her lover, Jason strolls around the apartment and nearly discovers the portrait Quinton painted of his wife. Later, we see Zoe at home, being awakened by Beckford's calls. She quickly dismisses him and approaches her family, suggesting a movie outing. However, her children decline her offer. The following day, Zoe returns home and is alarmed to see Beckford handing an envelope to her mother. She rushes to retrieve the envelope, and upon opening it, she finds a pair of her underwear. Sensing something amiss, Zoe's mother attempts to converse with her, but Zoe remains silent. Upon entering the house, Zoe discovers a gift sculpture from Quinton addressed to her husband. That night, Zoe visits Quinton's house and informs him that they can no longer see each other. He tries to convince her otherwise, but their discussion is interrupted by Beckford's arrival. She then clarifies that she summoned both of them to end things once and for all. They become enraged upon realizing that she was seeing both of them simultaneously. Zoe attempts to explain her illness and confesses her addiction to intimacy. Beckford becomes enraged and attempts to physically assault Zoe, but Quinton intervenes and manages to restrain him. Afterward, Beckford calms down and decides to leave. However, before he can exit the scene, and forcefully smashes it against Beckford's head, causing him to collapse unconscious on the floor. Zoe becomes frightened and attempts to pacify Quinton, but he begins to curse at her and adamantly declares that she cannot leave him. Despite her efforts to keep him at a distance by knocking down sculptures, Quinton remains undeterred. In a menacing pursuit, Quinton seizes a piece of glass and relentlessly chases Zoe within the confines of the apartment. She desperately tries to find a hiding place, but Quinton eventually discovers her whereabouts and continues his menacing advance. However, just as he is about to harm her, Jason suddenly appears and strikes Quinton's head with the sculpture he received as a gift. Zoe is initially terrified to see Jason, prompting him to angrily throw her cell phone to the ground while accusing her of engaging in conversations with her lover. As Jason prepares to leave, Zoe follows him, desperately attempting to explain the situation, but he refuses to listen. He insists on a divorce and threatens to take custody of their children. Overwhelmed by devastation, Zoe reaches her breaking point and walks into the middle of the street where she throws herself in front of an oncoming car. Following the tragic incident, we witness Zoe's devastated family in tears, Quinton's neighbor providing care for his injuries, and the closure of Zoe's company. Some time passes and it is revealed that Zoe miraculously survived the accident but required hospitalization. One night during her stay, Zoe experiences a vivid flashback from her childhood, recalling instances of abuse inflicted upon her by a group of boys. 6 months later, Zoe receives a call from the hospital, but Jason remains unable to forgive her and informs her that he intends to leave their home. Overwhelmed by depression, Zoe finds solace in the encouragement of her mother and friend, who convince her to join a support group specifically designed for individuals battling the same addiction as hers. The film concludes with Zoe bravely sharing her traumatic experiences during a group meeting, openly admitting that her addiction has shattered her family and her life. As Zoe pours her heart out, Jason unexpectedly enters the room, deeply moved by her vulnerability. Touched by his presence, Zoe seizes the moment to confess her mistakes, assuring Jason that she is determined to change. They embrace each other tightly, sharing a heartfelt kiss and reaffirming their unwavering love, vowing that it will endure forever. And with that, the movie ends. We hope you enjoyed our recap. Watch our next videos on the screen, and don't forget for more amazing recaps. See you on the next one.